So now you know a little bit about standard deviation and statistical significance. I would say that $122 purchase, I'm 99% sure that it's a statistically significant event. It's an unusual event. So that's where statistical significance comes in. Now that you know all that, let's go in and actually use the tool and figure out how to use that. So to get there, I need to get out of PowerPoint first, give you a quick view of Rothenburg, Germany, and call up version 2 of the statistical calculator. Version 2 has some good things in it, so if you have the old version, you might want to get the new version. First thing I'll show you is that there's a number of tabs down here at the bottom. The response rate tab is where you're going to go for most of the work. If you're comparing two things, version A, version B, or click-through rates from one website versus another, or click-through rates from one Google ad versus another, that's the tab you're going to want to be on. You might also be able to use this cost per response thing if you're doing the Google stuff. Sample size, that comes up if you're saying, okay, what does my sample size need to be? That's obviously going to be on this tab. So let me show you quick how to use all three of these tabs. First, on the response rate tab, let's say we're comparing two different lists, two different creative pieces, two different offers, two different websites, whatever it may be. You're comparing version A of something versus version B, or let's just call it element 1 versus element 2, whatever those two different things happen to be that you're testing. On the calculator, I've put mailed quantity, but it might be number of exposures of the ads if you're looking at click-through rate. To give you an example here, to get into that, let's say I go in and I say, okay, I mailed 100 pieces to list number 1. I got 10 responses from that. And that gives me a response rate of 10%, obviously. List number 2, for example, I mail 100 of those, and the response rate is 13. The number of responses is 13, so I get a response rate of 13%. So clearly, response rate 13% is better than 10. I'm happy about that. Looks like it's list number 2 is better. But down here, it says, well, your results are only 0.6 standard deviations apart. As we now know, that's not a lot. That's not necessarily an unusual event. And it says then you are approximately not very confident that the elements have different response rates. So based on this information, element number 1 versus element number 2, I can't say that element number 2 is definitely better because I'm not very confident that the two things pull at a different response rate. Now, if I had to pick one, if everything was equal, costs were equal and all that kind of stuff, yeah, I might go with that element number 2 or list number 2 or whatever it happens to be, because based on my tiny sample, it looks like it might have a higher response rate. But it might turn out it's got a little bit lower response rate. Now, what would have happened if we had more information, if we had a bigger sample size? So let's say we mailed not just 100, but something more realistic, like 2,000. And let's say I got 20 back. That, again, gives me a response rate of 200 back. That gives me a response rate of 10%. And over here, let's say I mail 2,000. Doesn't have to match, but let's pretend it does. And I get to quick doing the math, that'd be 260. And that, again, gives me the same response rate of 13%. But this time, I've mailed a lot more. I know a lot more. I have more information. And in this case, this difference of 13% versus 10%, well, that is 2.97 something standard deviations apart. That's an unusual event. That means, no, these two things aren't the same. List 1 versus list 2, I'm 99% confident the calculator tells me that these two things, list 2 versus list 1, they have different response rate. List 2 is a better list in this case. It's going to give me a higher response rate. So I definitely, in this case, want to go with list 2 because it's going to give me a higher response rate. Now the question is, I might even pay a bit more for list 2 because it's going to give me a higher response rate. Now the question of how much more am I willing to pay depends, of course, on how much more money I'm getting per respondent, how much money that per extra people is going to be worth to me. Those extra people are going to be worth to me. So that's a question that comes up then. So if you had, so that you have to factor in, I'm not going to go in that here, but this tells you that, yeah, definitely, everything being equal, I definitely want to go with list 2 or advertisement number 2 because it's going to give me a higher response rate. Now, if list 2 costs me a lot more money, then I got to do some mathematics to figure out if it's worth it. But all things being equal, along those lines, list 2 here is definitely better. I'm 99% sure that it's better. So that tells you how this tab works, the response rate tab works. Again, this could be click-through rate, whatever you want to calculate here. Sample size, let's talk about that. Let's change to this tab. In this case, in the example I've got in here already, let's say you're in a situation where it's been a long time, I've been mailing piece number 1, running ad number 1, whatever it is, and I'm going to mail 5,000 as a test, and I know it's going to get probably somewhere around 2%, 0.02, because I've run this thing before and it gets around 2% as a response rate. I just know that. Now I'm testing against that, let's say element number 2. It's got a different offer. Maybe it's got a higher offer. The coupon's $40 instead of the $20 I've been offering. So let's say, what would that give me? Maybe I think, okay, that's going to get me around 3% as a lift, or I'm hoping it's going to be 3%. The question is, okay, how many do I need to mail in this test? Well, if you think it's going to pull somewhere around 3%, this calculator, I put in all the numbers in the blue boxes, and it says, okay, 887 is the number you have to mail for this 3% to be significant. Okay, it's going to then say, okay, I'm 95% significant. If I see a 3% response rate, if I've mailed out 887, okay, I'm going to be 95% sure that that thing is a better offer. It is a better piece. I'm going to be sure about that. Now, let's say instead of 3%, I think, well, maybe it's not going to pull 3%. Maybe it's only going to pull 2.5%. How does that change things? Now notice this 2.5% before I hit the enter key for it is not that big of a difference compared to 3% versus the 2% that I think my control piece is going to do, the one I've mailed out before that I think is going to get somewhere around 2%. Well, how does that change things? Going not 3% but down to only 2.5%, I hit enter. And the calculator says, okay, now because you're only getting a much smaller difference here, you have to mail 4,632. That's obviously a lot bigger number because, hey, the difference you're trying to measure here is a lot smaller. So obviously, for that to be declared a significant event, you need a much higher sample size. So you can play around with things depending on your situation, both response rate tab and the sample size tab. Depending on what it is you're trying to figure out. So you'll go back and forth and put numbers in there depending on what it is, the real world marketing thing that it is you're trying to figure out. Now, bonus for you people who are worried about cost per response on Google AdWords and some other places like that. Special for you here, I've created a page that calculates what you're actually going to be worried about, which is the cost per response. Now, I'm not going to go in this in depth, but you can look around on this page and learn about a lot of things. But I've put in space here where you can put in data from 15 of your Google ads that you've put out there. And I've punched in sample data for, let's just say, 5 ads that I want to test. I've got 200 clicks from my first ad. It had 2,000 impressions. My cost for that was $2.40, not cost per click, but my actual cost for running those 2,000 ads and the clicks that went through there. That's right out of Google, obviously, is $2.40. And let's say my total number of responses was 12. So my question then is, what's the cost per response, and what's my surety that ad number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 is better? And if I put in my data here that I can get from Google AdWords, you can quickly ignore all this stuff up here to the right. You can just go down to this graph, and what you can see is clearly that ad number 5, here's my 99% confidence interval. Ad number 5, I'm confident that 95% confident that it's going to cost me somewhere in the long run between maybe 18 cents and maybe 37% on the high side, just by looking at this graph. Now that's obviously much higher than ad number 2, which is running at somewhere between 7 cents per and, I don't know, 11 or 12% or something like that. So this ad number 5, the cost per response, is a lot higher than ad number 2. And ad number 2 looks like it's also higher or lower, better than ad number 1, 3, or 4. So clearly ad number 5 is the most expensive cost per response. Ad number 1 is the lowest cost per response. So this is, if I'm just going to run one, I'm going to run this one. But for some reason, maybe there's reasons I want to run ad 3, 4, maybe also number 1. I don't know. Probably not 5. That's the first one I'm going to ditch, bury obviously, and I'm going to go with ad number 2. So that's a little bit about response rates, sample size, and cost per response. Let me quick throw up the advertisement here for the world-famous Teasley Statistical Significance Calculator we've talked about here. Again, it's available for download. You got to purchase it at teasley.net. If you have any questions, go to the website, track down my email address, send me an email if you wish, or you can just post if this is on YouTube. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can post down below YouTube. I'll check for comments there, and anybody's welcome to answer that if they have the answer to the questions. Chime in. We'll make it a little mini statistical question thing. Hopefully this helped you. Let me know and enjoy. And again, go to teasley.net if you need to download this. Thank you.